I think marginalized is a lot of times associated with oppression. That term marginalized, and it's not necessarily the case. And I think that society as a whole and civilization is sort of a work in progress. We're working all this out, and that's one of the beautiful things about you being able to discuss these things on your YouTube page, as opposed to just having to battle it out inside the echo chamber of the universities. You're able to express this stuff out in the world where people like me that are 49 years old that aren't in college have a chance to read this and see like, wow, what is this guy going through over there at the University of Toronto? And then you start to examine the laws and you start to look at what's going on here. And this egalitarian utopia idea, it's beautiful in its concept that we should all be able to get along and everything should be equal. The problem is it defies human nature. It defies the 200, 300,000 years of DNA that we have bouncing around inside of our bodies that demand certain types of behavior. And I think it's so important that we discuss these things. And I think that society and civilization as a whole, this thing that is ultimately in this growing state, this constant state of improvement and objective interaction. I mean, there has to be some sort of discussion. One of the problems that I have with the so-called social justice warriors and with this movement is that they're enforcing a certain type of thinking and behavior, and they're incredibly aggressive about it, hence the warrior term.
Yeah, well, I think a fair bit of that is grounded again in temperament, which is quite comical. I mean, one of the things that our research indicated, research on political correctness indicated that this trait, agreeableness, is a good predictor of holding politically correct views, and also that being female is a good predictor of holding politically correct views. And I think part of the reason for that, and the warrior aspect to it too, is that agreeableness is a maternal instinct trait, roughly speaking. And you know, human beings have very powerful maternal instincts. That's true for women and for men, because men are very involved. Male human beings are very involved in the raising of their children, which makes them quite different than many large animals. On the one hand, if you're very maternal, you're very compassionate and protective of those that are within your kin boundary. And you can try to include more people in that if you want. And that's the political goal. But you're unbelievably hostile to anyone who's outside of that you regard as a threat/predator. And so agreeableness makes you divide the world up into protected children and predators.
And you see that on social justice warriors Twitter pages. I mean, I follow a bunch of them, and I go to them and I watch this, incredibly supportive, to ridiculously so, of in terms of like mediocre expressions, tweets that, oh my God, it's so brilliant, and it's like you're saying almost nothing.
Yeah.
And they're so incredibly supportive of the people that think along their lines, and so incredibly hostile, and this idea of shaming people that don't agree with them, not interacting with them, but almost immediately insulting them, almost immediately marginalizing them, which is ironic. This is what you see constantly, is like super supportive and super aggressive against people that have any sort of an opposing viewpoint.
Yeah, well, they're all predators, the ones that have an opposing viewpoint.
And that's how they define them.
It's one of the things that's very comical about this, from my perspective, is that it's such sex stereotypical behavior, is that at the same time that the social justice warriors are denouncing the idea that psychology, for example, might have anything to do with sex differences, they're acting out sex stereotype behavior like mad in terms of their persecution of predators and their protection of the kin/in group. So.
And you are a social psychologist?
No, I'm not. I'm a clinical personality psychologist.
What is the difference?
Well, one of the differences is that personality and clinical psychology isn't a corrupt enterprise, whereas social psychology fundamentally is. It's been going through an absolute internal revolution over the last 2 years because of its own discovery that many of its fundamental studies and propositions are flawed. I would say social psychology is the most social justice / left-leaning part of psychology, and its methods are generally appalling. They're not well documented, and they produce all sorts of categories that don't exist, Whereas personality, I know it might seem like trivial distinction to people outside of the field, but these disciplines are quite separate from a historical perspective. They develop quite separately. Personality psychologists are very, very careful about defining what they measure. And so, for example, I study the big 5 personality traits. That's extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness, and under openness falls intelligence. These are very well documented. We can really measure them. We can't measure them as well as we would like to. We've identified the biological basis for most of the traits, and we understand a fair bit about how they make people different. And personality psychologists have been very, very careful about measurement, whereas social psychologists are, as a general rule, very, very cavalier about their concepts, and that's led to a tremendous pollution, I would say, of the psychological literature. The implicit association test is a good example of that. That's the test that's being used to assess people's unconscious biases, unconscious racial biases. And so, for example, if I showed you a bunch of pictures of black people and a bunch of photographs of white people, and then I asked you to associate a good or a bad word with the black people or the white people to respond after you've seen the picture. If you are white and you saw white photos, you'd be faster at responding to the positive words. And so they've used that as evidence of racism. But part of the problem with that is that you can't distinguish it from a novelty response. So, I mean, most people in a given racial group are far more familiar with members of their racial group. And the fact that they're more likely to associate negative things with racial groups that are outside of their racial group isn't something that can be easily distinguished from just a novelty effect. But they make wide-ranging claims about the inbuilt biases in people, and that's lent impetus to these movements that are racing through corporations across the United States and governmental agencies, where people are being subjected to mandatory unconscious racial bias retraining. And there's no evidence, by the way, that works at all. In fact, the evidence that there is suggests quite the contrary.
I saw this on one of your videos. You were discussing how preposterous this is on one of your videos, because one of the people that was opposing you was actually a part of something like this, right?
Yeah, well, the human resources and equity people at the University of Toronto have made mandatory unconscious racism training, anti-bias training, and they've made it mandatory for their staff. And I found that absolutely appalling. First of all, it's political re-education.
So when you say mandatory, like this is something that you had engaged in?
No, I didn't have to, because I'm not part of the human resources staff.
Okay.
But the people that they're consulting with to implement these sorts of programs certainly have faculty and students in their sites. I mean, these are trial runs for much broader rolling out of exactly this sort of re-education
process. What's the methodology behind it, and how's this been vetted?
Oh, I don't think it's been vetted at all. Like, if you're going to, let's say you want to put into practice an educational process, what you need to do is you need to measure the initial state validly, so that your measures, so you need to use multiple measures, and all those measures need to say the same thing. So if you're going to accuse someone of racism, you need several different measures of racism, and then you have to show that across all the measures, it's like using different meters. All the meters should read the same thing. Then you have to implement your educational intervention, carefully defined. Then you have to see afterwards if the consequence of the educational effort was a reduction in those initial indices, those initial measures. That sort of thing, when it's been done at all, has showed that educational interventions of that sort that are mandatory actually make racism and bias worse rather than better. But why let a few facts stop you? Because we already know from the postmodernists that there's no such thing as facts anyways.
So there's...
Look, in Canada, here's something. This is one of the things that really makes me proud of my country. Our government has now announced that the judiciary in Canada will be selected. If you're going to be a candidate to be a judge, you have to produce a dossier that specifies your identities, whatever they happen to be, racial, ethnic, religious. And then the committee that's going to appoint you to the judiciary has to have undergone mandatory anti-racism and bias training before they're allowed to serve on the committee. So basically, we've set up a situation in Canada where the people who select our judges have to go a kind of indoctrination that has no validity from a scientific perspective before they're allowed to select our judges.
Now, who's enforcing this? Where did
The
this come
Justice
from?
Minister.
But
the
where
Federal
did
Justice Minister.
Where did this program come from?
Oh,
Like,
there's all sorts of people who are offering these programs now.
And so
it's become a growth industry.
But what is their qualifications? That's a good question, right? None.
Qualifications.
Zero.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah.
The eyebrows are raised.
Yeah, well, there's no way of having qualifications for
Right.
doing this sort of thing because it's not a valid procedure.
So how do
people
they
who claim to be qualified. And
So they claim to be qualified. They come to the university and they say, I have a solution. The university
Yeah.
says, finally, just run with it. And
That's
they just
exactly right.
implement it because to question anything that would absolve racism is racist.
Yes, right.
Yeah.